Welcome, everyone, at Easy History Podcast. Today, we're going back in time to the Renaissance. It was a period of huge change in Europe, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It was a period of tremendous transformation, not just a revival, but a true rebirth of art, science, and thought, and its influence. Well, it still echoes in our world today.
The Renaissance, meaning rebirth, spanned roughly from the 14th to the 16th centuries. It seems like a dramatic shift from the medieval period.
It was, and the term itself points to that. Think about a world where the focus shifts from the divine to the human. That concept is what we call anthropocentrism, and it really was at the heart of the Renaissance.
A real shift in thinking. What were some of the things that made this transition to anthropocentrism possible?
Well, the medieval feudal system was declining, and at the same time you had these powerful Italian city-states rising, places like Florence, Venice, and Milan.
So it wasn't just ideas changing, but the whole structure of society.
You got it. These cities weren't just cities, they were hubs of trade and commerce, which created fertile ground for new ideas.
So as these cities were thriving, did people start to think differently about, everything?
Absolutely. You had thinkers like Petrarch and Boccaccio who were humanists. They immersed themselves in the works of ancient Greece and Rome.
So they were looking back to move forward.
In a way, yes, but they weren't just studying the past. They were rediscovering human reason and creativity. And this was a direct challenge to the medieval mindset, where religion was really the dominant force.
Sounds like an intellectual rebellion. Did everyone embrace these new ideas?
Of course not. But they resonated with powerful families like the Medici. They became patrons of the arts and sciences, funding artists and scientists to push boundaries.
It sounds like the Medici's support was crucial for this creative explosion.
Definitely. It was a perfect storm. Social, economic, and intellectual changes all coming together in Italy.
And of course, when we think about the Renaissance, we think about art. What innovations made the Renaissance style so unique?
Well, you have artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. They weren't just talented, they were pioneers.
True masters.
They were. They mastered techniques like linear perspective and chiaroscuro. This allowed them to create much more realistic and three-dimensional works. Think about Da Vinci's Mona Lisa with its subtle play of light and shadow, or Michelangelo's David, where you can almost feel the tension in the muscles.
It's incredible how they combined their knowledge of anatomy and the world to create these timeless pieces. But the Renaissance wasn't just an artistic movement, was it?
No, it was a time of incredible scientific discoveries, too. Scientists started challenging those long-held beliefs and making groundbreaking discoveries.
Like Copernicus, who placed the sun, not the earth, at the center of the universe.
Exactly. And Galileo, with his telescope, provided evidence to support that. Then you have Vesalius, who revolutionized the study of human anatomy.
It's like they were rewriting the understanding of the universe and the human body.
They were. And that spirit of inquiry led to something else, too. The development of the scientific method. It was a systematic approach to understanding the world, and it really shaped science as we know it.
So the Renaissance started in Italy. But did it stay there? How did it spread? And did it look the same everywhere?
It was like a wave slowly spreading to places like France, England, Germany, the Netherlands, and Spain. But it adapted and blended with the local cultures, creating unique flavors of the Renaissance in each region.
So, for example, what did the Renaissance look like in France?
Well, the French King Francis I was a big patron of the arts. He even invited Leonardo da Vinci to France. The royal court embraced the Renaissance, and it led to the construction of those magnificent chateaux and really a blossoming of French Renaissance art and architecture.
And in England, did they embrace the artistic side as well?
You could say that, but in England, the Renaissance really found its voice in literature. William Shakespeare comes to mind.
Of course, Shakespeare.
Yeah.
His works are still so powerful today.
They are. And his plays and sonnets truly captured the humanist ideals of the Renaissance, exploring human emotions and intellect in such depth.
It's amazing that centuries later, we're still captivated by those stories. But the Renaissance wasn't a single event, right? It had distinct phases.
That's right. Historians often divide it into three periods: the Proto-Renaissance, the High Renaissance, and the Late Renaissance. Each one had its own unique innovations and artistic styles.
Let's start with the Proto-Renaissance. What made this early period so significant?
Think of the Proto-Renaissance as the foundation. It began in Italy in the late 13th and 14th centuries. Artists like Giotto began to break away from that stiff, formal style of medieval art.
So they were starting to experiment with new styles.
Exactly. They started introducing more naturalism and emotion into their work. That paved the way for what would become the High Renaissance.
Giotto's work must have been revolutionary for the time.
Oh, it was. His frescoes, with their lifelike figures and expressive faces, were a real departure from the past. And we can't forget Dante Alighieri either. His Divine Comedy had a massive impact on Italian language and literature during this early phase.
It sounds like they were really planting the seeds for what was to come. And then we move into the High Renaissance. What were the defining characteristics of that period?
Well, the High Renaissance, mainly in the 15th century, saw artistic and architectural brilliance really come to the forefront. Florence, in particular, was a center of creativity. Artists like Filippo Brunelleschi, Donatello, and Masaccio pushed artistic boundaries.
Brunelleschi's dome for the Florence Cathedral is a marvel, isn't it?
It is. It became a symbol of the city's ambition and artistic skill. And then, of course, you have the three giants of the High Renaissance: Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael.
It feels like we can't talk about the Renaissance without talking about those three.
You can't. Each of them left an undeniable mark on art history. Da Vinci, the ultimate Renaissance man, blended art and science, which you see in works like the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. Then there's Michelangelo, with his powerful sculptures like David. And of course, those breathtaking frescoes in the Sistine Chapel. His work showcased a deep understanding of human anatomy.
And Raphael, with his incredible sense of balance and composition, really capturing the essence of humanism.
Absolutely. His School of Athens, for example, is a perfect example of that.
They really represent the peak of high Renaissance achievement, don't they?
They do. Their works embody balance, harmony, and technical perfection. But the Renaissance didn't end there. It evolved into the late Renaissance, where artistic styles shifted, and those Renaissance ideas spread further throughout Europe.
So let's talk about the changes in the late Renaissance.
Mm.
What artistic developments defined that period?
Well, in the 16th century, we saw the rise of Mannerism. This style moved away from the High Renaissance's harmony.
It sounds like they were starting to break the rules a little.
You could say that. Mannerism embraced elongated figures, complex compositions, and a heightened sense of drama and emotion.
So a bit more experimental and expressive.
Exactly. Mannerist artists like Pontormo and Parmigianino were really challenging the conventions of the High Renaissance, introducing this new level of expressiveness. And you have to remember, this was a period of social and religious upheaval in Europe. The Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation were happening. These tensions found expression in the art of the time.
So the art was reflecting the turmoil of the time.
Definitely. And it's fascinating how those artistic trends mirror what was happening in society at the time. Before we move on, let's circle back to Italy for a moment. What factors made Italy the birthplace of the Renaissance?
It seems like all these different threads came together in Italy. What were the key ingredients, so to speak?
Well, Italy had a unique set of circumstances. First, think about those ancient Roman ruins and that strong classical tradition. It was all around them. It provided this direct link to the past, inspiring them to rediscover those classical ideals.
It's like they were surrounded by these reminders of Rome's greatness.
Exactly. It was a constant source of inspiration. And second, remember those independent city-states we talked about? They created this competitive environment where innovation and patronage really flourished. They attracted wealth and talent from across Europe.
It sounds like a real melting pot of ideas and creativity.
It was. And finally, you can't forget about the patrons, those wealthy families like the Medici in Florence or the Gonzaga in Mantua. They generously funded artists, architects, and scholars.
So those patrons were really the engine that drove the Renaissance.
You could say that. Their patronage helped create an environment where creativity could truly thrive. So you have this blend of history, economic prosperity, and a culture of patronage, and it all came together to create the perfect conditions for the Renaissance to blossom in Italy. And then from there, as we've seen, its influence spread across Europe, leaving this profound mark on Western civilization.
It's incredible how all those elements came together at the right time and place to spark this cultural revolution. We've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive, but before we continue, is there a key takeaway you think our listeners should keep in mind as we continue exploring the Renaissance?
I think it's important to remember that the Renaissance wasn't just about imitating the classics. It was about embracing humanism, celebrating the potential of the individual, and questioning traditional ways of thinking. It was a period that really set the stage for the modern world.
Yeah, it really is amazing how, even though it started in Italy, The Renaissance just resonated throughout Europe.
Mm.
It transcended those geographical boundaries, sparked new ideas and movements across the continent.
It's easy to just think of it as just an Italian thing, but as we've been talking about, its impact was felt way beyond Italy. But before we get into those specifics, I think it's important to make sure we've grasped the essence of this whole era. What would you say were the most significant changes that occurred during the Renaissance? Like, what really makes it distinct from the period before? Well, I think it was a monumental shift from that medieval worldview. I mean, imagine a world where the dominant perspective goes from, primarily religious, God-centered, to something more human-centered. That emphasis on human reason, creativity, individual potential, it was truly revolutionary.
So it was like a period of awakening, a rediscovery of the human spirit, and all its capabilities after being kind of, I don't know, overshadowed by religious dogma and those feudal structures for so long.
Precisely. And this newfound confidence in human potential, it really influenced every aspect of society. It fueled so much. Artistic innovation, scientific inquiry, even just a renewed interest in classical learning.
It's fascinating how that shift in perspective, this humanism you're talking about, led to this explosion of creativity in just about every field. I mean, whether it's painting or sculpture, architecture, literature, science, you name it. The Renaissance was just this incredible outpouring of ingenuity and expression.
Oh, absolutely. It really stands as a powerful testament to the ability of humans to explore, create, innovate.
Now, as we go deeper, I think it'd be really helpful for our listeners to get a clearer picture of the individuals who actually shaped the Renaissance. We've mentioned a few names, but let's take a moment to really highlight some of those most influential figures, and their contributions. Who would you say were the real giants of the Renaissance? The individuals whose ideas and creations have left an enduring legacy?
That's a great question. I mean, there were just so many brilliant minds during this period, but if we had to pick a few standouts, I think Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael would definitely be at the top of that list. Their influence on art and thinking, well, it's undeniable.
Let's start with Leonardo. I mean, he was much more than just an artist. He was true polymath. He excelled in so many fields: painting, sculpture, science, engineering, anatomy. I mean, the list goes on. He really embodies that whole Renaissance ideal of the universal man. What do you think it is about Leonardo that makes him so iconic, even all these centuries later?
I think it was his insatiable curiosity and his drive to never stop learning. I mean, he wasn't content to just master one field. He wanted to understand everything: the intricacies of the human body, the workings of nature, how to capture those artistic expressions, you name it. If you look at his notebooks, they're filled with sketches, diagrams, observations that span a huge range of subjects. It's almost like he had this superhuman ability to see things that others just miss.
His mind was always working, always searching for connections and patterns. And his artistic masterpieces, like you said, the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, they still have this power to captivate and intrigue people. Even today, what do you think is it about those works that makes them so enduring?
Well, on a technical level, Leonardo's mastery of light and shadow and composition, it created this sense of depth and realism that was really revolutionary for his time. But even beyond the technical brilliance, his works, they capture something about human emotion, something mysterious that goes beyond time. I mean, think about the Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile, or the psychological intensity of the Last Supper. People are still interpreting and discussing them to this day.
It's like he infused his creations with a soul, a timeless quality that speaks to people across generations. Let's move on to another one of those giants, Michelangelo. He's known for his powerful sculptures like David, and of course those awe-inspiring frescoes in the Sistine Chapel. His work has this raw energy and emotional intensity that's hard to describe.
I know, it's incredible. Michelangelo had this amazing ability to just convey human emotion, all of it, through the physical form. His David is a perfect example. It's a symbol of Florentine strength and resilience, yet at the same time it captures this sense of youthful vulnerability and potential.
It really is breathtaking. And the Sistine Chapel frescoes, I mean, the sheer scale and ambition of that project is mind-boggling. Just to imagine the physical and mental stamina needed to create something so monumental. What do you think Michelangelo was trying to achieve with that masterpiece? What was the message he wanted to convey?
Well, the Sistine Chapel frescoes depict scenes from the Book of Genesis. The creation of the world, the story of Noah, and so on. Michelangelo wasn't just this master of art, he was also deeply religious. And so, in a way, I think the frescoes can be seen as a celebration of the divine, a testament to the power and majesty of God.
It's like even with all the focus on humanism during the Renaissance, Those spiritual underpinnings were still very much present for a lot of artists.
Absolutely. The Renaissance wasn't about just rejecting religion. It was this complex and multifaceted period where you had a celebration of human potential alongside this deep sense of spirituality. The two weren't necessarily in conflict.
That makes a lot of sense. Now let's shift our focus to Raphael. He's often seen as the most harmonious and graceful of those high Renaissance masters. When I think about his works, like the School of Athens, I get this sense of classical balance and serenity. It feels very different from the intensity we were just talking about with Michelangelo. How would you describe what sets Raphael's style apart from his contemporaries, like Leonardo and Michelangelo?
Raphael's art, it's all about clarity, balance, and elegance. He had this incredible gift for composition, for arranging figures in these harmonious groupings that convey this sense of order and tranquility. So, while Leonardo was exploring those mysteries of the human psyche and Michelangelo was all about raw emotion, Raphael's work, it exudes a sense of calm and idealism.
Like you said, the School of Athens is a perfect example of that. It's this depiction of ancient philosophers and scientists coming together, and it really celebrates human intellect in the pursuit of knowledge. And all of it is rendered in this balanced composition that just reflects those Renaissance humanist ideals.
Exactly. Raphael's work really exemplifies that Renaissance belief in the power of reason and the importance of classical learning. His paintings, they're not just visually stunning, they're intellectually stimulating. They make you want to contemplate those great ideas of the past.
Isn't it interesting how each of these three artists, even though they were working in the same period and were all influenced by those same ideas, developed such distinct artistic styles? They each brought something unique, their own perspective and temperament, and it really enriched the tapestry of Renaissance art.
It really shows the diversity and richness of the Renaissance. It could encompass this wide range of artistic expressions.
Now, beyond these artistic giants, we know there were tons of other individuals who contributed to the Renaissance. We talked about the humanist thinkers like Petrarch and Boccaccio, who really ignited that passion for classical learning. Who were some other key figures in that humanist movement? And how did their ideas shape the intellectual landscape of the Renaissance?
Well, that humanist movement was really a driving force behind so much of what happened during the Renaissance. The humanists, they challenged traditional ways of thinking. They paved the way for these new ideas about education, politics, the role of the individual in society. I mean, they were really questioning everything.
They were like the intellectual revolutionaries of the time.
They really were. One of the most influential was a man named Erasmus of Rotterdam. He was a renowned scholar and theologian. And he really advocated for a return to the original sources of Christianity. He believed in the importance of critical thinking and personal interpretation of those religious texts.
His ideas played a big role in the Protestant Reformation, right? I mean, he challenged the Catholic Church's authority and encouraged people to question those traditional doctrines.
Absolutely. That emphasis on individual interpretation of religious texts was a huge departure from the traditional view. Another key figure, Niccolo Machiavelli, a Florentine diplomat and political philosopher, his treatise, The Prince, caused quite a bit of controversy. It offered this very pragmatic, sometimes ruthless, I guess you could say, guide to acquiring and maintaining political power.
Machiavelli is definitely a figure who still sparks debate even today. His work really separated politics from morality, arguing that, well, rulers should prioritize the stability of the state above all else. It's fascinating and a bit unsettling how relevant his ideas still feel today.
Oh, his work absolutely caused a stir, but it had a lasting impact. It's this reminder that the Renaissance was this period of intellectual ferment. People were grappling with these big questions about religion, politics, the very nature of humanity.
And that intellectual curiosity, it wasn't just limited to those areas, right? It also extended to the realm of science, didn't it?
Yeah.
We mentioned Copernicus, Galileo, and Vesalius, but who are some of those other key figures who advanced scientific knowledge during this time?
You're right, there was a real resurgence of interest in the natural world, which led to those groundbreaking discoveries in astronomy, medicine, mathematics. One figure who comes to mind is Johannes Kepler, a German astronomer. He really built on Copernicus's heliocentric model. He developed these laws of planetary motion that explain how the planets actually orbit the sun in ellipses. Before that, everyone thought those orbits were perfect circles. His work completely revolutionized the understanding of the solar system.
So Kepler really challenged those old assumptions about how the universe worked. What about advancements in medicine? Were there any figures who really stand out?
Oh, absolutely. William Harvey, an English physician, made incredible strides in understanding the human body. You see, Through careful observation and experimentation, he demonstrated that blood circulates throughout the body, and it's the heart that pumps it. This challenged long-held beliefs about human anatomy and laid the groundwork for modern medicine. These breakthroughs, they were driven by a number of things. The rediscovery of those classical scientific texts, a willingness to question traditional authorities, and this growing emphasis on observation and experimentation. It was a time of intellectual freedom and a real thirst for knowledge.
It seems like the Renaissance was just this incredibly exciting time to be alive intellectually. I mean, all these new discoveries are being made, new ideas were being debated, and the boundaries of human knowledge were being pushed further and further. It's no wonder that we still feel the influence of this period today.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to remember that it wasn't just about rediscovering the past. It was about laying the groundwork for the future.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to make sure we acknowledge an important aspect we haven't discussed in detail yet, and that's the role of women. We've talked about a lot of those prominent male figures of the era, but it's essential to recognize that women played a significant role in shaping the cultural and intellectual landscape of the Renaissance as well. Can you shed some light on their experiences and contributions?
Absolutely. Women definitely faced a lot of limitations during the Renaissance, but they were certainly not absent from the scene, especially in the intellectual and artistic realms. Some women, often from wealthy and influential families, had access to education and were able to pursue their creative passions.
For example, Isabella d'Este, the Marchesa of Mantua, was a huge patron of the arts. She was known for her incredible collection of antiquities, and the library she built was one of the finest of its time. And on top of all that, she was a prolific writer, corresponding with all these leading intellectuals and artists from all over Europe.
Isabella d'Este, she was an amazing woman. Her court in Mantua really became a center of Renaissance culture. It was a magnet for all these artists, musicians, writers, you name it. She was a true trendsetter.
And then you have Vittoria Colonna. She was an Italian noblewoman and a poet. Her sonnets were renowned for their depth of emotion and intellect. She was considered one of the leading literary figures of the time.
Vittoria Colonna's work really shows how much women contributed to the intellectual and creative energy of the Renaissance. Her themes explored love, loss, spirituality. She engaged with the same ideas that her male counterparts were grappling with.
It's inspiring to see how these women, and countless others like them, challenged those societal norms and found ways to make their voices heard, to participate in the intellectual and artistic life of the Renaissance. And I think it's important to acknowledge that many of their stories are still hidden from history. It makes you wonder about all the other women who contributed to this period, but whose contributions were never fully documented or recognized.
You're absolutely right. As we continue exploring the Renaissance, it's crucial to keep in mind those hidden figures, those untold stories. But for now, I think it's a good point to pause in our deep dive. Let our listeners absorb everything we've covered so far. It really is amazing how much creativity and innovation flourished during that time period.
It's like an explosion of ideas and artistic expression. But we were just talking about how the Renaissance wasn't just about this, sunshine and roses and progress. There was definitely some shadows, some darker aspects that we need to look at.
That's a good point. I mean, while we celebrate all those artistic masterpieces and scientific breakthroughs, it's really important to keep in mind that those benefits weren't equally distributed across society.
So you're saying that even as humanism was flourishing, even as new ideas were spreading, society was still dealing with those age-old problems of inequality.
Exactly. The majority of people in Europe were still living in poverty during the Renaissance. Life was hard for most people. Those living conditions, the working conditions, they were often really harsh. And the gap between, the wealthy elite and the common people, it was huge.
It's almost like, those advancements in art and science, they didn't necessarily translate into a better life for everyone. While we might admire the achievements of the Renaissance, it's also important to remember the struggles of those who were, just trying to make ends meet to survive.
I think that's a really crucial point. And when we talk about the rise of humanist values during this period, it wasn't necessarily a time of, widespread social justice or equality.
It seems like there's a bit of a disconnect there, wouldn't you say?
Hmm.
I mean, on one hand, you have this celebration of human potential and a push for individual expression, but then at the same time, you have all this inequality and social injustice.
It's definitely complex, that's for sure. And then there's the issue of conflict and violence during the Renaissance. I mean, it wasn't a peaceful time by any means.
It's almost hard to imagine, isn't it, when you think about this era that's known for all this great art and all these new ideas, But at the same time, you have all these wars and conflicts happening.
Right. It's like these two sides of the Renaissance existing side by side, this flourishing of art, science, thought. But then at the same time, you've got these ongoing wars, the religious conflicts, political instability. And it makes you wonder, right, how all of that turmoil might have shaped the art and ideas that were being produced.
It's like you can't just ignore what's happening in the world and expect that it won't have any influence on, the creative output of a society.
Exactly. It's all connected. For example, the constant power struggles between those Italian city-states, that definitely had an influence on the political philosophies that emerged during that time.
And then you have the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which really divided Europe along religious lines. That led to decades of conflict and persecution. It's hard to imagine that those events wouldn't have somehow affected the art and literature of the period.
Oh, absolutely. The religious and political turmoil, it was everywhere. It permeated every aspect of life during the Renaissance. And it reminds us that we can't study history in a vacuum, right? To really get a sense of a period like the Renaissance, we have to consider all its complexities, the good, the bad, the triumphs, the struggles.
So it's really about embracing that, that nuanced view of the Renaissance. Instead of just romanticizing it as a golden age, we need to acknowledge the darker sides of that time and recognize how those, conflict and inequality really influence the course of events.
A more balanced perspective, definitely. It helps us appreciate the amazing achievements of the Renaissance while also recognizing that there were limitations. And it's important to acknowledge those who didn't really benefit from the advancements of that time.
Now, as we start to wrap up our deep dive into the Renaissance, I want to touch on the idea of legacy. I mean, what's the lasting impact of this era? How can we still see its influence on our world today?
I think it's safe to say that the Renaissance left a profound and lasting mark on Western civilization. All those humanist ideas that emerged with their focus on individual potential, critical thinking, that thirst for knowledge, they really laid the groundwork for many of the values we still hold dear today.
It's amazing to think that this period, so long ago, could still have such a powerful influence on our world. What are some concrete examples of that Renaissance spirit living on today?
Well, take those humanist ideas we were talking about. They had a huge influence on the Enlightenment, that movement which emphasized reason and individual liberty. And those Enlightenment values, in turn, really shaped the development of modern democracies.
So you're saying there's a direct link between those Renaissance humanists and the thinkers who shaped our political system?
Oh, without a doubt. And the Renaissance, with its emphasis on classical learning and its focus on human anatomy, the natural world, it paved the way for the scientific revolution. The scientific method, with its focus on observation, experimentation, and questioning, that's a direct descendant of that Renaissance spirit of inquiry.
So, in a way, the Renaissance was the seed for our modern scientific world.
I think that's a great way to put it. But the impact, it goes even beyond those areas, science and politics. Think about its artistic legacy. I mean, so many techniques that Renaissance artists developed, like linear perspective and oil painting, they're still used and adapted by artists today.
And those architectural masterpieces from the Renaissance, I mean, the Florence Cathedral, St. Peter's Basilica, they still take your breath away. They're these incredible testaments to human imagination, our capacity to create beauty and something truly grand.
And we can't forget the literature. Shakespeare's plays are still performed worldwide. And Machiavelli's writings on politics, they're still relevant to discussions about power and leadership even in the 21st century.
It's like those works tapped into something about the human experience that's just timeless.
You're right. And at its core, I think that's what the Renaissance was all about. It was a celebration of human potential. It was about exploring those complexities of what it means to be human, all its different dimensions. And that's a legacy that, well, it resonates with us even today.
So, at the end of our deep dive, the most important takeaway, maybe it's this: that spirit of curiosity, the courage to challenge those old ways of thinking, and that belief that through reason, humans have this power to solve problems and create a better world.
That's beautifully said. The Renaissance, it reminds us that we're capable of so much, that progress is possible when we're brave enough to question, to explore, to imagine new ways of being in the world. And that's a spirit that, well, that's something we can all cultivate. It's something we can embrace in our own lives.
What a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for taking us on this journey through the Renaissance. I know I've learned so much, and I hope our listeners have too.
The pleasure was all mine. It's always a privilege to look back at history, to see how those events of the past, they connect to our present, how they shape who we are today.
To everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity about history. And maybe it's given you a new appreciation for the legacy of the Renaissance. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, keep those minds curious.